WInnForum, and I'd like to welcome you to the 17th in our webinar series. Today's webinar is going to be on the COMSEC document that's being developed in our Spectrum Sharing Committee Work Group 2 and some discussion on other security-related topics. Before the webinar starts, a few introductory notes. First, I'd like to thank the forum sponsors. These are the folks who provide a little bit of extra support to the forum in order to allow us to put on events like this one that you're seeing today. So thanks to Finmechanica, Google, Motorola Solutions, and Thales for their help. Some administrative. If you want a copy of the slides, we'll post them at wirelessinnovation.org/webinars. Those will be posted later today. If you need more information or you're having trouble accessing anything, please feel free to send me an email at lee.pucker@wirelessinnovation.org. And if you want access to any of the balloted and approved reports, recommendations, or specifications that you'll hear about today, you can go to groups.winnforum.org/forum-work-products, and that's where everything can be found. During the webinar today, the interface, I'm assuming everybody's connected to audio already, but if you need to switch between mic speakers and telephone, please feel free to use the audio interface to do that. If you're going to submit a question, there's a questions window, and so go ahead and type the questions there, and I'll see them and pick them up, and then I'll pass them on to the people who are presenting, and they can then address the questions as we go. The speakers today have asked that you ask the questions as they're going versus waiting till the end, and that way we can have more of a dialogue as it goes. If you want to ask a question in voice, please feel free to, there's a little hand symbol on your interface. Please feel free to click that. That'll raise your hand. I'll get that symbol, and then we can turn on your microphone so you can ask a question that way. Today's speakers are Greg Billock and Matthew from Google and Matthew Probst from Federated Wireless. And with that, I was going to turn it over to Matthew, but it looks like we just lost his audio.
I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew.
Great. All right. You're going to pass me presenter. Great. Hold on one second. Let me pull up slides here. Okay. Thank you, Lee, for that introduction. As Lee mentioned, do please feel free to post questions as we go, either audio questions or via the GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar control panel. And we definitely want to answer and have this be as fluid of a discussion as possible. We have a lot of content to get through. I'm going to try to basically likely gloss over some of the basic concepts that of cryptography, so that will allow us to focus more on the critical issues at hand, which are the CBRS specific application of cryptography and the COMSEC document contributions. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we'll be providing an overview of PKI, public key infrastructure and encryption, what it is, a little bit on the threat model, the threat model doc that we have, and why that is relevant. And then we will be touching on the current proposed lifecycle and usage for each of the roles in the system. That includes the root certificate, the intermediate certificates, as well as SAS, domain proxy, professional installers, PAL, and CBSD. Keep in mind that some of these are not fully defined, and this webinar is certainly not to lay out this is the exact way that we are definitely going to be doing all things. but it's certainly to start the conversation with respect to the areas that have not fully yet been defined. So at the end of this, we'll highlight a few areas that we definitely need contributions on and have policies that need to be defined by the WInnForum. We believe that security is not simply something you apply post-protocol. Security needs to be defined as to help you enforce your general policies. So we can't just define a protocol and define policies independent of security. And I'll get into some examples of why that is. So, okay, so to start off with, we will go over a few slides that some of you who may have taken a networking course from Jim Carosa and Keith Ross, they're known for Alice and Bob slides. Beginning, what does security mean? Security means a lot of things, and it's not just cryptography. It's not just protecting data in flight, protecting data at rest. It's also protecting other things like physical security, durability of the data. Will it be available? Can you change the storage so that you lose data so it's not durable? Availability of the service. That is especially applies within the CBRS system. The SAS providers have to be fully and highly available for the system to function, given the FCC and the incumbent requirements. COMSEC does not address availability. So there's other areas that must be considered by all the participants that are outside the simple COMSEC considerations. Mutual certificate authentication and TLS and certificates do help with some of these areas, and I've highlighted them with asterisk, but they don't cover those necessarily completely. And so we simply need to be conscious of what they can cover and what they may not cover. So we need to know the limits of what cryptography can do and what it doesn't do. First, we need to establish policy before deciding how to use cryptography. Cryptography and PKI don't create policy, but they can help us enforce established policy. So this is where we're looking for the forum, and we'll get to this later, to help establish policy around life cycles of trust.
Hey, Matt, quick interruption. We're not seeing your slides change. We're still seeing the cover slide.
Oh, really? Can you see that?
Yeah, now it looks like you're on slide 4 now.
Yeah, so it looks like presentation mode is not working.
Okay.
With following along, let me see if there is. Let's try this. Apologies for that. Do you see changes now?
It looks like you just shut the whole thing off.
Okay. Maybe we'll just try in this mode. Can you see this?
Yeah, we're not actually seeing anything. It doesn't look like you're sharing your screen anymore.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me share the main screen. How about that?
Yep. So okay. It looks like we're on slide 2.
Yes, and can you see that transition?
Yep, it looks like you're stepping through now.
Okay, so sorry about that. So security, there's many means of security, as I mentioned, and certificates and TLS can assist with some of them, but we need to understand what cryptography can help with and what it can't help with. And for the areas that it can't help us, we need to have other compensating controls. So start off with knowing the limits of cryptography. We need to establish a policy before deciding how to use it. And as I mentioned, cryptography and PKI don't create policy. They help enforce established policy. So again, knowing cryptography's limitations. Cryptography must be complemented with other controls for full policy control. And I love this XKCD cartoon saying, you know, you can have really, really good cryptography and not break it, be able to break it through the standard methods. But through other attacks, such as a $5 wrench, you can get around the issue, right? So introduction to public key cryptography. Symmetric key cryptography is where both the sender and receiver share a single secret. Both of them know the same secret. It's the same input, and it is a secret. And if you encrypt it with a secret, you can decrypt it with the same secret. So the question is, how do you agree on the key in the first place? And how do you have a unique key for each and every individual that you're communicating with? Public key cryptography gets around this issue by not having a pre-shared secret between both the sender and receiver. The public encryption key, keys in public key cryptography come in pairs. There's a public key and a private key. The public key is known to everyone, and the private key is only known to one of the individuals, the individual that holds the key pair. In this case, we say the receiver. If Alice on the left wants to send something to Bob and ensure that only Bob can read that text, then Alice will take Bob's public key and encrypt the message with his public key, resulting in ciphertext, send him the ciphertext through some unsecure means, and Bob can then decrypt. Only Bob can decrypt that ciphertext, because that ciphertext can only be decrypted with his private key, because the key pair is special. Only Bob can decrypt it. We can take this one level further and say, if Alice wants to send a message to Bob and she wants to authenticate her message so that Bob truly knows that this message only came from Alice, then she can take her message and encrypt her message with her private key, then encrypt it with Bob's public key, which is the resulting ciphertext. Bob can then take the message and decrypt it with his private key. This is actually inverse order, wrong on the slides, but decrypt it with his private key. Yeah, that's actually correct. Decrypt it with his private key, and then with Alice's public key, and he will know that, one, only he could have received this, and only he could receive the message, and then second, Alice was indeed the person who sent him the message. The message only could have come from Alice because it was encrypted with her private key. Certificate authorities are methods whereby, or are entities that take a public key and stamp it with information attesting to the identity of the holder of that public key. So we take Bob's public key and stamp it with the private key of the certificate authority, and this is a certificate authority that's saying, we know Bob exists, we know who he is, he's a person, he's real, and maybe encrypt some information about Bob, such as his other contact information, and place it in that signature, so that anybody who views the public key has access to Bob's. Anybody who has access to Bob's certificate has access to his public key, as well as a signature by the certificate authority stating that indeed this is truly the correct Bob's public key. So we don't have to do individual pre-sharing of public keys. We can have a certificate authority attest to who owns what key, because they've done the legwork to verify and validate that Bob is indeed who he says he is. Public web certificates. Here's an example of a public web certificate, one off of ge.com. They contain quite a bit of information. We won't go into all that, but anybody can open up a browser and view information in the public certificates. Within CBRS, we have several different roles, and there are trust boundaries between the roles. It would certainly be a lot easier if, in many systems, security is a little bit easier when you only have one operator and one entity that has administrative control of all entities interacting with the system, because you know there's only one operator. But in CBRS, we have many different entities, and we have to establish trust between those entities. That includes non-internet users attempting to access SAS. We have CBSD operators, domain proxy operators, PAL holders, professional installers who may have a web interface into SAS. We have domain proxies as well as the CBSDs themselves that use a standardized interface into SAS. There's SAS-SAS communication, and there's a proprietary link between ESC and SAS. Each of these are trust boundaries, and each of these boundaries can be used as an attempt to gain access to some confidential or privileged data. It's basically an asset that is held by SAS, or an asset held by one of these entities that individuals or organizations may wish to try to exploit. Certificate authorities within the system also hold valuable assets. Certificate authorities that grant the certificates to each of these roles, they have the authority to grant those certificates. So if I can trick a certificate authority into believing that just walking off the street, I have a certified CBSD device and I need a certificate for it, or I am a professional installer and yeah, I've gone through that certification course, then I basically can circumvent the intended trust roles within the system. So threats against certificate issuance and revocation for each of these entities, we need to track them and understand them and find ways of mitigating them and establish policy and controls around mitigating those threats. Here's an example of Masquerade Attack. If there's as an example, we have a category A CBSD, and we're using the standard TRB protocol. And TRB protocol is, in this example, let's assume that this category A CBSD has been compromised and is running some malicious code. How that CBSD is compromised, we won't go into, and certainly we want to have compensating controls to try to reduce the possibility of malicious code running on CBSDs. But the fact is, CBSDs will become compromised. So when they are compromised, what access does the attacker have within SAS? Well, they can use the TRB protocol and the existing certificate that's on the CBSD to communicate with SAS. The TLS session that's established between the CBSD and SAS, it's a recognized session, right? It's a trusted category A TLS session, and within that certificate that was used, the client certificate on the CBSD that was used to communicate with SAS, there are several certificate extensions, such as the certificate type, the CBSD ID, max grants, and possibly even injecting the category of CBSD within the certificate extension. That's the TLS session. Within the TLS session, I can run any protocol and any protocol above that I want, and if an attacker has access to the CBSD, the attacker can inject a new CBSD ID that's part of the TRB protocol, and he basically can masquerade as a category B CBSD, and inflate the number of maximum grants that that attacker should have access to. So what this means is that the SAS provider needs to validate the protocol values against the certificate values, so that the certificates that are embedded in the CBSD at manufacture time, any values that they have embedded within them, such as a CBSD ID or max grants or certificate type, they cannot be circumvented simply by injecting a different protocol value on top of it. Another example is using the same category A CBSD. What if I now masquerade as a domain proxy, also talking to SAS? If the domain proxy is simply another protocol that we speak over a TLS session, here again, we need to validate the certificate values, the values that are within the certificate on the TLS session against the protocol that is running over the top. Okay, let's now jump into the proposed CBRS PKI hierarchy and lifecycle. And as I mentioned, this is the current proposal. And it is proposed that we have a single chain of trust. And later in the presentation at the end, I'll bring up some open issues, and there is an open discussion around whether we should even have a standardized common root of trust across all entities within the CBRS system. But this is the current proposal on the table, and we can discuss other options later. The proposal is to have a single root of trust that is operated by a commercial certificate authority that has been under the mandate of WInnForum, and this certificate authority, the root of trust, would have a backup copy of those keys in escrow, held by either individual members of the WInnForum with some sort of threshold cryptography, or some other secure backup, so that those keys could not easily be recreated unless it has truly been mandated by WInnForum. This is to prevent the case where the commercial entity that is acting on behalf of the WInnForum, operating the CBRS root, goes out of business or is somehow in breach of contract, that we can, as an industry, can move to a different provider without having to rotate the root keys. The reason why this is important is because this root key will need to be embedded on all entities within the system, including hardware devices that chain down or chain off of that root of trust. We envision that this root of trust, the CBRS root, is and will be offline. The goal is to minimize the probability of the root private keys being compromised. So we envision that this will be offline, stored offline, and an extremely rare occasion pulled back online for signing of the first, or signing of the intermediate certificate authority, or what we might also call an operating certificate authority. Might call it an operating root, because this is really the root that does the actual signing, because the real root is offline. But the real root, again, we want to keep it from being compromised and keep it, but still have it be available, so that if the immediate certificate authority, intermediate certificate authority beneath it becomes compromised, it can be, the intermediate certificate authority can be replaced. Underneath the intermediate certificate authority, we have various roles, and we have the top of the chain of trust for we might call it a role certificate authorities. So this includes SAS providers, domain proxies, professional installers, prioritized access licenses, and CBSD manufacturers. Each role certificate authority can and will do the signing of certificates for each of the individual entities underneath that chain. So SAS Provider certificate authorities will sign and issue SAS Provider certificates. And they will have a certain policy around what accreditation, what sort of certification, and what procedures they follow in issuing SAS Provider certificates. Those policies will be completely different from how CBSD manufacturer CAs issue CBSD certificates, which will be much more in mass scale. We know that there's a small number, there will likely be a small number, handful of SAS providers, whereas a CBSD hardware will be deployed and certificates there will be issued in very large quantities. Of course, the SAS providers and each of the role CAs will need to depend on the entities, basically the entities below in the circles you see in this box and on the slide, for understanding and receiving the actual certification to be able to issue the proper certificates. So that could be SAS certifiers, domain proxy certifiers. In the case of professional installers, those are trainers or training programs. And what still needs to be worked out is, the FCC will be issuing PALs, and the PAL CA needs to respect their license grants. We also would like to enable, if possible, a secondary market PALs. And in this proposal, this discussion today, we can review one possible proposal for how that might work. CBSD manufacturers, we propose that there be a role CA for CBSD manufacturers, and that role CA can either directly issue CBSD certificates or sign an intermediate certificate down to basically manufacturer OEMs. So the manufacturer itself can run the certificate authority and issue their own certificates if they abide by the proper procedures and WInnForum guidelines for how to issue certificates and what to embed in them and so forth. Note that in this diagram there's the role roots. We definitely envision that there will be multiple role roots, and even though these are depicted in this diagram as separate boxes, there's no reason why one entity can't fill multiple roles. A single commercial CA today, for example, may decide that they want to offer certificate authority services to each of these chains and act as a role for each of these chains, the role CA for each of these chains, which is perfectly fine as long as, of course, they abide by the security practices and policies set for each of the respective role routes that they are attempting to serve as. Here's an example CBSD certificate lifecycle, and we can definitely do this. I haven't done it for any of the other certificate types, but this is simply an example of what it might look like for CBSDs as they are manufactured. So a manufacturer submits their CBSD, their hardware device, to a certification body, and the certification body creates some form of evidence of certification, which the manufacturer then turns around and submits that evidence to the CBSD certificate authority. The CBSD role certificate authority will then receive and validate that evidence, that attests to that indeed, yes, this is a device, it's certified, it follows all of the WInnForum and FCC guidelines, etc. And the CBSD CA can then issue a manufacturing CA or OEM CA intermediate certificate for this device. And the CBSD manufacturer can then mass produce the devices and issue their own unique certificates for each of the devices. And then, of course, the manufacturer sells the the device or multiple devices to a CBSD operator, and that CBSD will have embedded in it a unique, one of those unique key pairs and certificate, which would then be used to authenticate against one or multiple SAS providers with the CBSD protocol. Now, of course, in some cases, these may leverage an EMS system, may go through a domain proxy, which is basically a completely different slide. In that case, the certificates would be issued to the domain proxy and not the individual CBSDs. So, any questions so far? I haven't heard or seen of any questions so far.
I'm not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay, we'll continue. So as we choose the particular key lengths and algorithms, there are certain trade-offs and certain things that need to be understood. For example, RSA keys of 1024 in length have been deprecated already. Those should not be used. And later in our slides, we will go over each of these certificate types and talk about the key length that we're proposing for those certificates. And should be basically understood that, for the next 15 years or so, 2048 are sufficient. Bit RSA keys are sufficient, but there on out, we definitely want something longer. There is some trade-off and thought that it has to go into how exposed the system is and how the system is designed. Is this embedded hardware, or is this something you deploy and manage at cloud scale? And how frequently we rotate the certificates. So the proposal is, for example, for SAS providers, that these are publicly exposed. The complexity of a certificate rotation is fairly low. These are running in cloud. They're managed by control systems that can fairly easily rotate their certificates. So we propose a fairly short validity period, and of course, automatic periodic rotation. For domain proxies, same thing. Domain proxies we envision, even though they may be an on-premises cloud, they may be in a public cloud, we would recommend a fairly frequent rotation of those. For professional installers, this really depends on the policies that the forum comes up with for how long the validation period is for a professional installer's training program. But independent of the professional installer's training program, we don't want these certificates to be too long. So even if the professional installer has to request and resubmit their accreditation, their certification for having passed a accredited training course, even if they have to redo this twice or a few times over the life of their training, it should be acceptable. Certificates in the hands of humans, as well as many computers, are notorious for being lost. So it's okay. It's wise to periodically rotate those as well. PAL licenses. It's proposed that we consider locking the validity period of the PAL licenses to the PAL grant period itself. And CBSDs themselves, being embedded hardware, in some cases it's maybe very difficult to rotate their certificates, having longer certificates validity periods for those. Also, it should be noted that it is under discussion what requirements, if any, the WInnForum will place on hardware protection of private key material as well as firmware. That's, I know, an ongoing topic. There's a trade-off of CPU requirements versus key lengths. So this is a test on a Intel Xeon system. Shows you, obviously, the larger the key size, the more CPU power is required for doing signing and encryption, basically encryption and decryption with keys. And this is something, this is not exact science. I ran this on one of my servers last night, but it's fairly well understood that the more bits you throw at it, we could certainly mandate massive key sizes and gain, in attempts to gain security for many, many, many years in the future, but there's a trade-off for the amount of CPU required, and we don't want, certainly even the embedded systems, to incur massive CPU overhead. Okay, starting with the CBRS root. The CBRS root is the holder of, and we're going to go through a slide like this for each of the roles in the system. The CBRS root is a single commercial entity contracted by the Commission to generate and maintain the CBRS root keys. And it serves as a permanent root of trust. We envision this root will be offline. And it is basically the WInnForum contracts with this entity. The WInnForum has the ability of moving to an alternate certificate authority in the case of some sort of breach of contract, or the certificate authority goes out of business. And so there's no upstream certificate authority. These are basically fresh keys with backups in escrow. And before you can issue, before this can be created, this would be, like I say, a contract with WInnForum, as well as Web Trust version 2 certification. So basic recommendation as part of the COMSEC document is that any entity that has the ability of issuing multiple certificates, any certificate authority within the CBRS ecosystem, should follow and be certified underneath Web Trust version 2. The only proposed extension for these certificates is basically saying the role of the certificate is CBRS root. And this is there's no level of automation possible here. This intentionally requires a very slow, difficult, expensive key generation ceremony. And immediately after the keys are generated, it is used to sign one level down the intermediate certificate authority, and then immediately the keys are pulled offline, private keys, and there's no automation, no automatic interaction with these key pairs. The communication method for revocation, because there's no upstream provider, you will get email news that these will have to be revoked. It would be a very, very bad thing if these were ever compromised. The proposal is rather than generating a single pair of keys and that we embed within devices, the proposal is to generate a few different pairs to mitigate for possible breaches in the future of one of those key pairs, or possible changes in technology. So we propose both generating and maintaining 2 key pairs RSA, both of which being 4096-bit, and as well as 2 ECC pairs, but initially only using a single RSA pair operationally. In the future, should we need to change to a different algorithm or rotate to a different key pair, we could do so, but either way, the keys would be at least pre-distributed and at least pre-generated anyway. This would be a fairly long validity period for these keys, 40 years. The intermediate root, again, proposal is to use a single commercial certificate CA to operate this, and likely it'd be the same certificate authority that runs the root. And this would be, you might call this an operating intermediate or operating, I might call it an operating root, but it is the root that's online and available to sign the role certificates. And so it's pretty much used and only used to sign and create role CA certificates that serve as the top of each certificate chain. Here again, the verification requirements would be a contract with the WInnForum. Though in this case, the CA may pay the WInnForum. And in all subsequent cases, if you would like to be a CA in the system, participate in the system, you would basically pay a nominal processing fee to the WInnForum to process your contract. And the contract basically being you will abide by the WInnForum's guidelines and requirements and so forth, and you will maintain Web Trust v2 certification. Notice the previous slide, the CBRS Root, the WInnForum pays this entity, or the intermediate CA, and all other CAs, possibly, they pay the WInnForum a very nominal fee, and basically allows that any certificate authority that abides by the guidelines who's willing to pay a nominal fee can enter into this ecosystem and create a competitive market for certificates within the ecosystem. The X59v3 certificate extensions for the intermediate certificate authority are the role, as well as possibly some sort of contract ID indicating, hey, this, they are legitimate. Here's the contract ID that they have with WInnForum. There's not really much automation that you can have with issuing this certificate because it requires a very slow, intentionally slow key signing ceremony and pulling the root certificates online very briefly to issue this certificate. The revocation method would be through CRLs, and here again we hope that this would never be broken, but there's a possibility of, if the intermediate certificate authority, because it's online, because it's is issuing the role roots, it has a higher probability of being compromised than the root certificate itself. So if it is compromised, then we could pull the root certificate online to create a CRL and communicate that to the entities in the ecosystem. The quantity of the certificates, initially just a single certificate, and have the same period of validity as the root certificate itself. Next, we'll talk about the role certificate authorities. And this includes the role CAs for SAS providers, domain proxies, professional installers, PALs, CBSD or CBSD manufacturers. The holders of these would be a small number of commercial CAs or any entity that abides by the appropriate guidelines that wishes to offer certificate authority CA services to the ecosystem, to one or more of these roles. And the purpose of this is to serve as a trust anchor for those roles and abide by the policies as set for each of the respective roles in the system. Usage to sign and issue certificates within the respective role chains. These certificates would be issued by the online intermediate CA. And here again, verification requirements is you'd have to have a contract with WInnForum saying you're willing to abide by the policies, procedures for issuing certificates of that respective role. So you were willing to say, validate the documentation that WInnForum guidelines for documentation required for professional installers or CBSDs, etc., for the respective roles. Also, as a certificate authority system, you have to maintain Web Trust v2 certification. The proposed extensions for these certificates are the role, and this would be dependent on the specific the role type. And here again, operating authority, it would be a WInnForum contract ID. Level of automation required. There can be some automation here. This slide's an error, given that the operating the intermediate certificate authority is more online, but negotiating and verification of the contract is intentionally an extended validation or a manual process that's required. Communication method for revocation of these certificates, proposed that we leverage CRLs, and for each of these certificates we propose 4096-bit RSA, and the validity period for these certificates being 10 years for most of the CA role types, but CBSDs being 20 years, because CBSDs, again, the proposal is that we would not rotate them as frequently as the other roles. The role of a SAS provider itself, any entity that operates a WInnForum FCC certified SAS service. The purpose is to authenticate to peers and as well as clients, SAS peers, domain proxy clients, as well as CBSD clients. So this is presented at the TLS endpoint of the SAS provider, and this is issued by the SAS-CA. Before the SAS-CA will issue a SAS provider certificate, that SAS-CA needs to receive and validate the documentation showing that that SAS provider itself has passed the WInnForum and FCC certification requirements. The certificate extensions are the role, again, being SAS provider in this case. Operating authority being a WInnForum FCC certification ID, something showing that, you know, here indeed this is something that possibly somebody can look up out of the certificate and look up an FCC database saying, oh yeah, okay, that's the FCC ID of this SAS provider. Level of automation possible during issuance is fairly low, because we envision there's going to be fairly few SAS providers. Intentionally, the bar for certification is very high, and so we want to ensure that there's fairly few of these that are issued, and that it's not easy to circumvent the system and trick a SAS-CA into issuing you a SAS provider certificate, effectively doing a man-in-the-middle attack against entities with, you know, either CBSDs or domain proxies. Communication revocation methods. Communication method for revocation. Proposed we leverage CRLs and OCSP. And number of certificates is fairly small initially. And initially we proposed these to be 2048-bit. Given that we are, the proposed validity period is fairly small, being a year plus 90-day grace period, we can start with shorter keys, or keys that are, you know, that NIST is currently saying should be valid up until 2030, and we can rotate them, and eventually the key length will increase as the 2048-bit keys become less secure. Domain proxies are the role of a domain proxy. Again, any entity wishing to operate a certified domain proxy who holds the certificate. This is for use to authenticate the domain proxy into the SAS provider and present it on each TLS connection into SAS. The domain proxy certificate authority itself is what issues these, and the verification requirements are some form of documentation saying the domain proxy has passed the WInnForum guidelines, which I know are still being worked out.
Hey, Matt, we have a question.
Yeah.
So Tony Sotika asked, what's the purpose of the grace period that you just mentioned?
This allows for overlap, and this is commonly done in web certificates. So even though you might purchase a 1-year certificate, we could call this a 1-year certificate, but it allows for, you know, certificates, because they are verified, and they are verified very strongly that if your certificate is no longer valid, meaning it is past the time, it is basically an expired certificate, the systems will not communicate. They will completely reject all communication. It's not a soft error. It's a very hard fail. So the purpose of the grace period is to allow for some overlap of running on the old certificate while obtaining a new certificate. That basically says, rather than forcing entities to start their renewal process for certificates around the 9 or 10 month time period, which may in some cases require additional certification or somehow renewing their credentials with the FCC and some sort of testing process that can take some time, rather than having them be forced to start that well in advance of the year, we could say, okay, around the year mark, that's when you need to start the process of redoing, having your SAS retested by the FCC and get a new, if that's required, and then renewing your SAS or your domain proxy or your SAS certificate. That way you can rotate your new certificate in place while your old certificate still has some valid use life. But you never ever want to wait until the last day, right, before you rotate your keys. You want to rotate it out well in advance, so there's no chance that you would ever run over the expiration time. Okay.
We have another question.
Sure. Yeah.
From Reinhard Schrage, wants to know how in general is a renewal of a certificate done? Is the entity, for example, run with the old and new certificate concurrently during the grace period, and what if there is no grace period like in the other cases?
What if there's that last question? What if there's no grace period? What? Sorry.
Like in the other cases.
Oh, in the other cases. So we certainly can discuss having a grace period, but it should be assumed that we want to allow for long enough validity periods that there's an embedded grace period or embedded time when people can have enough buffer room that they can run on an old and run on a new certificate. The actual process for rotation, that's really dependent on the implementation. The actual process for rotation for certificates within CBSDs and within hardware devices is going to be completely different than the SAS providers. It's going to be completely different than the professional installers, for example. But we highly encourage that whatever system is there, that all actors automate as much as possible for the rotation, so that it's not simply a manual process each time. I don't know if that answers the question, or if there's any follow-up question to that.
I'm not seeing a follow-up at this time.
Okay, so quantity of these certificate domain proxies, we envision that there be a decent number. Here again, because we're rotating it fairly frequently, we can get away with a shorter RSA key, and then as the useful life of 2048-bit RSA keys begins to wane, we can bump that up to a longer certificate. Domain proxies with domain proxies just like SAS, we envision those will be more of extended validation, because domain proxies are an entity that we want to absolutely ensure is following the FCC guidelines, and it is hardened and is kept as secure as possible. As compromising domain proxy would be very bad for the ecosystem, because of the permissions and capabilities of the domain proxy to generate CBSDs en masse. Okay, moving on. Professional installer. And here again, this is one of the areas that we're looking for more WInnForum policy to be defined on. But we propose that professional installers should hold certificates, and they should use those certificates to interact with the system and to certify their actions and their behavior as they interact with the components within the system. So, so this is to authenticate CBSD installation data, and this actually may include some Class A installation data, though I think most Class A CBSDs, most of that data is either embedded in the certificate, or you don't need, certainly don't need a professional installer for it. But primarily to authenticate CBSD, Class B CBSD installation data. So this would be used by professional installers to somehow digitally sign the installation data. Now, this hasn't been defined. We're looking for the WInnForum to define the policy around what entities the professional installer should interact with. And there's several candidates, right? Professional installers could interact directly with the CBSDs and use their certificates and some software to sign data. Then the signed copy of the data is placed on CBSDs, and CBSDs turn around and pass that data to the SAS. Professional installers could be interact through some interface on domain proxies and enter that installation data and sign it with their private key. Or the professional installers might interface directly with SAS, and here again use their keys to sign and authenticate the data and attest to the correctness of the installation data, which includes various parameters, including location and whether it's indoor versus outdoor and antenna model. The professional installer certificate authority would issue these certificates as requested by an accredited professional installer training program. So we envision that likely there'll be training courses, training programs that you have to go through, and of course we're looking for the WInnForum, we're looking for policy around that. I know there's some discussion around that. But what is the result of that training program? The result of that training program should be to kick off a authenticated issuance of a certificate to the professional installer itself. And the professional installer certificate authority needs to verify and receive evidence that indeed this one individual has successfully completed the training course, and before they will issue the certificate. The X509 v3 certificate extensions for these certificates will be professional installer, and it's maybe something unique showing the operating authority for this particular professional installer, including the training program ID plus some sort of training program certificate serial number, much like the CBSD ID, where we're talking about an FCC ID plus unique serial number for each device. Level of automation possible during issuance for these certificates. It really depends on the relationship between the accredited training program and the professional PICA, professional installer certificate authority. So the initial, we definitely envision that as training programs themselves become accredited, they will form a relationship with the PICA, professional installer certificate authority. The professional installer certificate authority will do some manual verification of the training program itself, that this is a legitimate training school. They're not just somebody who's throwing up a web page claiming to do training, and that the training school is valid and is legitimate. Once that relationship has been established, the training program then will have a relationship with the PICA, Professional Installer Certificate Authority, and will likely have web interfaces into the PICA to have the PICA issue certificates to the individuals that have successfully completed that particular training program. The quantity of certificates here could be fairly large, and these are recommend 4096-bit RSA. Validity period, initially we propose 2 years, plus a bit of grace period. And the revocation method proposed using CRLs plus OCSP. And an interesting discussion that needs to happen is the policy around revocation of professional installer certificates. For example, if a professional installer misbehaves or loses their certificates or something, then, and you need to revoke their certificates, does that invalidate how much of the work and how many of the digital signatures that they have issued? How much does that invalidate? So if we find a professional installer that's lost their private key, how many of their of the entities that they've signed do we trust? Is it a rogue nation or some rogue entity that has stolen their key and has gone ahead and used that stolen key to sign things, and that indeed does need to be invalidated. So there definitely needs to be a policy around what and when, what are the factors whereby we would actually want to revoke a professional installer certificate, and what that means in terms of the system and the pieces of data that they have signed using that certificate. Okay.
Matt, we have another question.
Sure.
It's another question on the renewal period and validity period. It's there are different scenarios thinkable that may happen during a renewal period. For example, if different entities in a hierarchy chain have to occur renewals. Any prevention against creation of a certificate black hole during multiple renewals?
Certificate black hole during multiple renewals. I don't fully follow the question.
Reinhard, you want to ask the question verbally? I can turn on your microphone. Reinhard, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. The question is, or relates to, if there are several certification, renewals happen at the same time and at different places in the hierarchy that you showed in one of your first initial slides. So if there is a renewal, say somewhere in point, somewhere in the hierarchy, and then somewhere a little bit lower down, you have another renewal as well. It might happen that some of the lower points actually need to ask back for the authority of a certain certificate that is currently being updated or renewed as well. Is there any danger of creating something like a chain that never really gets resolved?
A chain that never gets resolved.
Question clear? Did I make my question clear?
So I think I understand the case where that there's obviously several different. Each of these are separate entities, and these are separate chains in some cases, and
yes.
The certificate authorities themselves have to renew periodically, and every entities beneath them have to renew periodically. And if somebody up the chain has to renew, then that certainly affects my certificate. Now, I think that from my understanding, this is already is partially already included within the signing structure. For example, if I'm a certificate authority, if I'm a role CA, say a SAS CA, and my certificates are set to expire in 2 years, I will not, as a SAS CA, won't be able to issue additional certificates beyond my own validity period. So yes, everybody beneath me will need to renew, and there has to be some sort of communication or automatic reissuance of certificates beneath me within my chain.
Okay, so a renewal at a higher hierarchy level actually requires renewal on the lower levels as well, doesn't it?
It does if the renewal is for expiration, yes.
Yeah.
Now, there's no reason why, there's no reason, as long as you're not revoking the certificates, I mean, if you, either revoking or expiration will definitely mandate renewals at the lower levels. If a higher level is renewing, even renewing without a pending expiration, if it's still a valid period, and that old certificate's still valid, then there's no reason why you can't run concurrently on both certificates and not force the lower certificates to renew until the higher level has truly expired.
Okay, thank you. And that, of course, has an impact on the number of actions that need to be done and that probably need to be scheduled in action windows. If you're looking at the number of CBSDs or whatever entities actually are in the lower hierarchy chain, and something happens in the higher hierarchy chain, then actually that gets compounded. And so that I was just trying to get my head around what the impact, the operating.
Absolutely. And so one of the goals of these particular expiration periods, and I don't know if we finally tune them or not, we certainly should review this again, is to have the higher levels of the chain be a multiplier of the expiration periods that are lower in the chain. So that, for example, the very root, we propose 40 years. In fact, I'll back up to the, so this doesn't include all of the, but very root, we propose 40 years. CBSDs would be very long. We propose those being 10 years. The CBSD CA being 20 years. So it's twice as much. And of course, SAS providers, being only effectively 1 year plus a grace period. So we do envision that there should be automatic, periodic, forced renewal through these, fairly conservative, in some cases, validity periods. But those should match up almost like cogs, in two gears with the certificates above you in the chain. That's, it's not, they won't match up perfectly, but that's generally the goal.
Okay, this is my last question on that one. These are the normal, in the normal flow of operation. In today's volatile world, where we have terrorist groups and state-supported terrorism and all that, if you find yourself that somebody from somewhere actually is hijacking a certain certificate, and you are then actually forced to renew at a certain high level, then I was just trying to get a handle or get an idea on how much work actually is involved from the operating point of view in order to really say jumpstart the entire system.
Sure, absolutely. So yes, there absolutely will be entities in here that are compromised. And yes, rogue nations have lots of compute power, and there's more compute capacity on compromised desktops in the world than there is the fastest supercomputers. So we need to plan for cases where certificates will need to be rotated and need to be revoked. So yes, and in some cases they will be very painful, especially the ones that are certificates are embedded within devices and in firmware and so forth. But firmware manufacturers need to be able to handle that, be able to remotely update the firmware and certificates on devices. Yeah, we basically, it definitely, the whole system needs to be much more to allow for dynamic, more ephemeral certificates, I might say, rather than ultra long-term fixed static certificates.
Yeah, and so that needs to be built into the design so that later on you don't find yourself between a hard case and a rock.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the question. All right. So we're just finishing up professional installers. Prioritize access licenses. This is something I know that has been discussed lightly within WInnForum. We are looking for the policy that WInnForum might propose around professional prioritized access licenses, as well as secondary PALs. In the ideal world, rather than simply, an operator, a CBSD operator, claiming to SAS that they have, quote unquote, a certain amount of bandwidth within certain geocodes, ideally they would be able to back that claim up with a certificate. And so this would be used by CBSDs or domain proxies to request spectrum with prioritized access. And and there's a few different ways of how that might, these certificates might be used to truly validate the request. For example, the PAL certs can be used to sign the CBSD certs that they're trying to operate on, or the domain proxy certificates, so that SAS can know with a surety that, yes, this PAL holder really does want to use that CBSD or that domain proxy for that spectrum. The proposal is that, for issuing these PAL certs, these would be issued by a PAL CA, and that PAL CA would need to receive evidence, positive evidence, that the entity requesting the certificate is indeed the rightful owner of the PAL grant that the FCC issued. The one proposal, and this is, there hasn't been much discussion on how to enable secondary markets, but if I'm a PAL holder and I have a certificate that has embedded within it various census tract IDs, as well as basically a time window whereby I can operate. We can add that to the certificate extensions, basically a validity period, not just an expiration date, but also a start time of validity. Then one way of enabling a secondary market is to allow the PAL certificate holders to trade in their certificates and receive in return a number of sub-certificates. So if I, for example, I were the holder of 10 megahertz in 5 census tracts, I had a single PAL certificate showing, hey, here are the specific 5 census tracts, and and I have 10 megahertz in all of them. I could trade that certificate in to the PAL CA that issued me the certificate. That CA would return back to me 5 different certificates, 1 per census tract, showing that they have bandwidth, 10 megahertz of bandwidth in each of those census tracts. And then I can or either trade back to me those certificates, or perhaps more importantly, issue those certificates to an entity of my choice, an entity that I have leased that spectrum to. The original certificate that was valid for the entire 5 census tracts, that would be ultimately be invalidated by the certificate authority. So that would be revoked upon issuing the individual certificates. So only one entity would really have operating authority for each of the census tracts at any given moment, and there wouldn't be minimal overlap, if any, of multiple certificates authorizing PAL within basically the same FCC authority within a given census tract. So this is just one idea. Definitely looking for contributions of other ideas, or if this is one possible way of doing this. This way, go ahead. Is there a question?
Yeah, I was going to say there's a question from Max Solon. He wants to know, is a sub-area PCIs or portions of PALs be created that are also certified from the parent PAL?
Yes. So we assume that only the parent PAL would have the authority to request the child PALs. Only the parent PAL could request subdividing their PAL and issuing those sub-PALs to the entity of choice that the entity that the parent PAL designates. That would be part of the procedures for the verification requirements for issuance of secondary PALs. Okay, so for the primary PALs, there is some sort of manual verification. It would be nice if this could be somehow automated. If when the FCC issues the PALs, it'd be nice if they did it in a way that it could easily be correlated and cryptographically correlated with individuals. I don't know if that's going to be possible, but secondary PALs, this can simply be, as I mentioned, an automated process for exchange. The primary PAL owner would programmatically and via API, via UI, exchange their PAL into the PAL CA and designates the entities that they want to issue the child PALs to. And again, that could be divided either via geography, or it should be divided via time as well. So the PAL certificates, and like I said, I haven't added it here, but PAL certificates should have a start time and a stop time, effectively a start time as well as a validity period, so that if I have, say, a 5-year PAL, 5-year primary PAL in one census tract, I can divide that up into 5 different child PALs, one for each of the years, and there would be no overlap of those operating rights, so that only one entity would have rights. So as soon as December 31st rolls over, the new owner would have operating rights. The quantity of these could be fairly high because of the number of census tracts and how much you're subdividing it based on time. But we propose this be 49.6-bit RSA. All right, moving on.
So, wait, there's an additional question, Matt?
Sure.
Max had a follow-up to his original question. Can a new PCI subarea be claimed from original certified PAL on a rolling basis?
Can the original area be reclaimed on a rolling basis? So it's definitely possible if you can, as each of these child certificates or secondary PAL certificates, if they should all be able to be rolled up if all of the holders of those certificates agree to roll them up back to a primary certificate. So I should be able to, for example, if I own a PAL that's in 5 census tracts for 5 years, I should be able to subdivide maybe the first couple of years and not subdivide the next couple of years. Also, if for some reason I hold a bunch of different PAL certificates, I should be able to take all of those and trade them in. If I'm legitimately the owner of those or holder of those for that given time period, I should be able to trade those in to aggregate them back together. And in the way that would work, just like enabling the secondary certificates, those secondary certificates that you're trading in would be invalidated. They would be expired. They would be revoked, and you would be issued in return a valid certificate that is the aggregate of those child certificates.
So Max actually wants to ask an additional follow-up or clarifying question. Hold on, I'm going to turn on his mic.
Great.
Max,
Matt, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, but this process of trading in means that when the children PCI or PAL certificates are created, the original parent is sort of traded in and invalidated.
Right.
And what I was envisioning was that the parent still stays valid, but the parent is not used for the CBSD claims, only the children are, and that the owner can claim new children all the time. In other words, on a rolling basis, you can claim new children based on the parent PAL without invalidating the parent PAL, because otherwise it's going to be very cumbersome that you'll have to constantly have reversion or some process to understand, you know, what the claimant is doing. So I envision that the claimant has the right to the whole area and can claim sub areas at any time and not do it all at once. In other words, he doesn't have to do it in the beginning and get all those children's certificates. Because what if he decides he gets 10 children's certificates and then he decides he wants an 11th and a 12th? How does he go back and create new children in areas that he didn't claim little sub areas?
Well, yeah, the assumption here is that all of the entire PAL, so the assumption here is that your PAL license always exists in some certificate form, whether that be in a single large certificate or a single large certificate plus a few children that you're leasing away. But it always exists in some form, and there's only one entity that ever has only one of those certificates is valid at any given moment for a given census tract for operating. I think it would be good to try to avoid leaving the primary or the original PAL certificate valid, because it's much easier for participants in the system to use standard communication methods such as OCSP or CRL to basically revoke those. But the original holder doesn't have to subdivide. They can subdivide whatever they want when they want. They can break off little portions if they want to, and they can add those back if they want to. I mean, the little portions that they break off can be portions either, again, geographies or time that they break off, but that should not invalidate the other portions of the certificate.
Okay,
and much of this should simply be automated. And yes, it will be a process of creating new certificates that have digitally signed the new census tracts and new validity periods for each of the census tracts. But most likely, this is all programmatic interfaces, so it should be fully automated.
That sounds good, Matt. I'll probably have to talk to you separately online just to make sure. Offline.
Sounds good.
This is Greg Billock on the call now. Sorry for joining late. Yeah, I think the PKI can support what we want to do here, but it's not a splendid fit. So we need to make sure that we can capture the full range of what we want to do with PAL authorizations, and that we're not adopting something that's going to be cumbersome and cause us, a lot of problems as we go forward with how frequently these will be traded and so on. If they're traded infrequently, it probably doesn't matter so much that it's not a great fit. It'll work fine. If they're traded really frequently, then we'll really start to suffer by not choosing a mechanism that's appropriate to the trading speed.
Yeah. Yeah. Though having some way of cryptographically enforcing the trading scheme is a wise idea, right? I mean, otherwise, it will be.
Yeah, absolutely. So right. Yeah, we'll definitely need a way to secure that trading process for sure, but it may not be expressed in exactly this way. This way is more geared for kind of contract speed, thinking sort of days, weeks, months kind of transfer rates rather than, very rapidly. So if that matches the outcome of what comes down in the PAL secondary market, second FNPRM questions, then I think we're fine. If it doesn't, or if the industry wants to move in a different direction, we'll have to rethink this.
And one of my thoughts, this is sort of at contract speed, though we would leave it up to the PAL CAs to innovate here. And if they want to create some sort of, a great API for this, for easy interaction, hey, just basically leverage them for your subdivision and automating the process and doling them out and recombining them. It's basically a chance for the PAL CAs to individually innovate independently from each other. Okay. Moving on, CBSDs. These are the most common certificate type in the system. Any entity that wants to operate a WInnForum FCC certified CBSD, and the purpose is to authenticate into SAS providers and authenticate manufacturing time characteristics of the CBSD that basically cannot be changed after manufacturing time. So even if the CBSD has been compromised, there are certain things that cannot be changed by the entity that has compromised the CBSD, such as including FCC ID and serial number, or basically CBSD ID, as well as maximum grants. And I do think we should have a healthy discussion about whether we want to include device type or category A, category B device as well in there. These certificates would be issued either by a CBSD CA itself or through a designated OEM CA. So any manufacturer themselves can issue their own certificates, provided that they follow, again, the Web Trust V2 guidelines, as well as the WInnForum requirements. Hopefully, the level automation possible is very high. Because of the quantity of certificates, we want this to be as seamless as possible, and we would expect and hope that the CAs that are involved in the ecosystem would innovate here by providing automation and offer simple interfaces to the manufacturers to issue requests and issue certificates. The communication method for revocation, CRL plus OCSP. We also have left the door open for a proprietary protocol, meaning if a SAS operator happens to be the manufacturer of CBSDs themselves, and that SAS operator is basically the only entity that is interacting with the CBSDs, and that SAS operator becomes basically the only entity, the first entity to discover malicious or misbehavior on behalf of the CBSD, then we will leave it open for communicating and either between SAS operators, include this as part of the SAS-SAS protocol, or within the SAS operations about which entities that they are going to blacklist. Here again, we recommend 4096-bit RSA and visually propose 10 years of validity.
We've got another question from Max.
Sure.
And I may not be reading this right. It says the other issue is what is contained within the TEE, Trusted Execution Environment. Let's make sure tuning control firmware is within the TEE.
So this is, as I mentioned earlier, bottom right-hand corner of this slide is, I know it's under discussion, and I know this is, there's been some healthy debate, from my understanding, of the level of protection required for both the private keys as well as the firmware. So I'm not going to touch that third rail as part of this call. I'll leave that for a separate discussion. But it definitely, yes, I do want to call out that it has been proposed by certain entities that both firmware have trusted boot, so that it cannot be manipulated at boot, as well as the private keys associated with each of these certificates be stored in hardware. So retrieval of the private keys then becomes extremely difficult. Okay.
Just as that is a very important discussion, and it impacts a lot of facets of the CBRS. It impacts how the devices get certified, what kinds of authorization they need to transmit, and so on. So that's an important discussion. I'll just note, kind of in passing, I don't want to derail the discussion into that, but I think that using the PKI to reflect that abstraction gives us a lot of flexibility. So maintaining the invariant that the ability of the device to communicate with the SAS or with the domain proxy is basically it wraps or encapsulates the certification by the FCC of the security mechanisms that were built into that device, allows us a lot of flexibility, and it scales everywhere from not that much security is required by FCC if that turns out to be their decision on how to regulate the band, or it scales all the way up to, as was suggested, a kind of a secure boot with hardware security and tamper-proof storage of the keys and everything that entails. So we've got quite a bit of flexibility within this framework, and we can, kind of, in some sense, make sure that the FCC does their job of picking how strict or how rigorous they want control of that CBSD device to be within the context of this security framework.
Yep. Okay. CBSD OEM Certificate Authority, we've already reviewed this. Basically, a manufacturer wishing to operate their own certificate authority, they would be granted permission to sign one level down of CBSD certificates for a given CBSD. So here again, if they were to come out with a brand new, completely different CBSD that has to undergo new FCC certification, then they would have to have a separate CA for issued to them by the CBSD CA for that signing. So before we can be issued these CAs, you have to have documentation showing your specific CBSD has passed WInnForum certifications, and you have a valid WebTrust v2 certification, because you are then trusted to issue certificates mass scale. Level of automation, this is here again because we're issuing a certificate authority certificate itself. We're proposing this be manual. And communication method for revocation, this should simply be CRL plus OCSP. Quantity certificates, we envision maybe a few hundred, depending on number of manufacturers that are interested in doing this themselves. Validity period, 10 years. We're getting towards the end of the presentation here, the slides that I have. So we'll open up for discussion in a few moments. But I just want to provide the same slide I provided in an earlier WInnForum face-to-face meeting, that WebTrust 2.0 requires various controls. And these are very important controls on your operating procedures and your key management and certificate lifecycle management. And these need to be fully documented as well as audited to be able to pass WebTrust. We want to basically avoid the situation or reduce the probability that a given certificate authority would be compromised because there are standards. Or we also want to reduce the chance that any entity wishing to provide certificate authority services, even if they don't have the best practices in place, we want to ensure they have some minimum bar of controls in place before they can issue certificates in the system. So next steps, I know there's some ongoing discussion around the concept of the concern around having a single root of trust. And the concern has been brought up that given that there's limited key space within devices And given that some devices will, that key space may be already occupied for other purposes, including communication with EMS systems and so forth, there is a desire to reuse existing keys that are already being used to talk to EMS systems that are signed by a private certificate authority, not that is a certificate authority that's not external to the company, not external to the manufacturer. So there's some discussion that needs to happen around that. We need to have a common agreement on the verification requirements and policy around what information is verified for issuing each of these certificate types. Is it, the pieces of documentation that I've listed in these slides, or what are additional items? We also need additional clearer policy around PALs and discussion around PALs, as we mentioned, as well as professional installers. What does it mean to receive a professional installer certificate? How do I use it? What is a professional installer training program, and how is the training program itself certified? And how does the professional installer certificate authority know that the training program is certified? And when a professional installer certificate is revoked because that professional installer had their laptop stolen out of the front seat, then what does that mean for all of the entities, all the digital signatures on installation, CBSD category B installation data that that professional installer did? What does it mean for all of that? Do we revoke it? Do we force the professional installer to go through to get a new key and go back through all their former work, or do we, what is the policy around that? And finally, for all of any entity that wishes to perform certificate authority responsibilities within the ecosystem, we need to have some formal WInnForum contract. That basically means that will help govern the behavior of that certificate authority for their respective role within the system. That they will indeed validate either manually or automatically validate the material provided to them for the entity that's applying for the certificate. And so that is pretty much all the slides I have today. What sort of questions are there?
So if people have additional questions, feel free to type them into the questions window, or else click the raise your hand button on your interface, and I'll turn on your mic. Doesn't appear that we have any additional questions coming in. Maybe give it a few more seconds for people who are typing.
Sure. So one of the questions I saw is, will this presentation be available on the WInnForum website? I'll ask that, and the answer is yes. Can SAS itself authenticate the CBSD firmware version? Yeah, we've already covered that. That's a separate.
And the recording today will be, I'll be uploading it to the YouTube channel, the forum's YouTube channel later today, so it'll be available there. Max asked a question, what is PI? I think that's professional installer, correct?
Yeah, professional installer, yeah.
Okay, it doesn't look like there's any additional questions. So,
okay, thanks for everyone's time today.
I think Matt and Greg, thank you very much for preparing this and hosting this for everybody. I believe it's provided a lot of value to a lot of people. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Greg.